Hello and welcome to a very short, sort of brief overview of the background of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Very, very short novel, as those of you who have already read it will have figured out, about 150 pages, 100 to 150 depending upon the print. Reason behind its brevity, its shortness, is the fact it only cost a shilling. It was known as a shilling shocker when it came out in 1886. It was a method of publishing that was very, very popular in the Victorian times. Very cheap, very easy to get out there, and you would write your stuff. You'd have your pamphlet, your little piece, and out it would go, a shilling at a time. A lot of the Victorian literature that you study was written in very short, sharp bursts, and that's kind of where the idea of chapters came from. So you wouldn't have a novel going from one end to the other because the cost of printing an entire novel was far too much. So you'd release it weekly. Charles Dickens used to do it all the time. Release it weekly, release it monthly through some kind of periodical or magazine. However, Jekyll and Hyde came out later part of the 1800s. Queen Victoria on the throne. You can go and you can have a little research about everything you can possibly find out about Victorian times. However, what the novel does is basically focuses on the element of repression and duality. So repression, to take something and to bury it as deep as possible so no one can see it. And then the idea that you are living two lives, a public and a private life. Very, very important in the Victorian era, because you had a very, very strict society that had a very strict set of rules. So as you can see at the top of the page, repression, and that other word I mentioned, duality, having two sides, duality, is indisputably a cause of troubles in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Now that's not an accident. A writer writes something based upon their own experience. Robert Louis Stevenson himself had many, many problems with illness. And he was not socially accepted. He travelled south from Edinburgh. He was Scottish by birth, so therefore he wasn't necessarily accepted, and there were certain parts of his character, certain parts of his accent, his attitude he had to repress. So him living in Victorian England gave birth to this idea, this story, which has become so popular. The repression in Victorian society was that people were not supposed to have any overt or outward sexual appetites. There was to be no violent behaviour, no great expressions of emotion. Everything, there's a lot of comedy shows take the mick out of it, parody the fact that in Victorian England emotions were very staid and very grey and very dull, and you were not supposed to show emotions in public. Everything had to be sober and dignified. You're not really supposed to be happy. You're not supposed to show that you're happy or that you're sad or that you're joyful. Everything had to have this sort of calm demeanour. Think of a swan. Everything was perfect and beautiful and unruffled on the surface, and underneath you're paddling away like a maniac. But that was this idea. I mean, this little quote here is just taken from Shmoop, and again, it's a website that we subscribe to on this channel. Was excellent for just getting to the point. This would somehow take away from your focus on morality. So the more Dr. Jekyll's forbidden appetites are repressed and pushed down, his natural appetites that every human being has, the more he pushes them away, the more he wants to be Mr. Hyde, the more he wants to be this dark side of him. And the stronger Mr. Hyde grows as well. This is clearly demonstrated in the novel when Dr. Jekyll decides to go cold turkey, 2 months. So he says 2 months he will not become Mr. Hyde. He will not become his evil alter ego. And then when he finally does slip and goes back into Mr. Hyde, he finds out that the evil that Mr. Hyde is capable of, the desire and the appetites, have been magnified. Now what you've got there is this very simple story. And remember, at the time that people were reading this, They didn't have the knowledge that we have. We now know that Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. They're two sides of the same coin. The people reading this novel did not know that. It starts off as a mystery novel. I'll discuss that in a little bit. But it starts off as a mystery novel where two people are trying to find out the identity of Mr. Hyde. No one yet knows that it's the same person. So there's a load of different ideas in there. The idea that you have to repress parts of your own personality in order to fit in with society. Something that we've probably all felt in our time, and which is probably why the novel has stayed with us for so long. So it's this idea of public versus private. You have internal thoughts. You have an internal thought tract. You don't necessarily share it with the whole world because, well, maybe I'm just speaking for myself here, but if anybody heard what I thought of them actually, they probably wouldn't want to speak to me. You've got the idea of good versus evil. We all have instincts. We all see the big red button and want to push it, despite the fact that we shouldn't, and we know we shouldn't. But there's a little devil on your shoulder. There's a little Bart Simpson going, just do it. Let's see what happens. The inner versus the outer. The idea that there's a different life going on within you that you wouldn't want to show people. You have hopes, you have dreams, you have fears that you're not going to share with everyone because you're scared. I mean, that's normal. I've watched my own children grow up from being robust, tiny little toddlers who are afraid of nothing because they do not have the experience yet to become slightly more fearful. As they gain more experience, they start to worry more. And there's that idea that they'll begin to repress that and they'll begin to worry, and that'll all develop, and it's all very natural. Social and antisocial behaviour, again, this idea that within your head you have certain thoughts that you don't want out there. You don't want people to hear your thoughts about them. You might be completely wrong about them. That's one of the reasons why you don't want to hear. The higher versus the lower class. So certain characteristics that Mr. Hyde possesses would be seen in Victorian England as being lower class. His banality, his language, the way in which he speaks. He calls someone a liar. These things would be seen to be massive and disrespectful and completely shunned in the Victorian era. The intelligence versus physical strength argument. The whole idea that Dr. Jekyll is an intelligent, rounded human being who seeks pleasure in reading religious texts, who seeks pleasure in intellectual pursuits. However, Mr. Hyde is a physical human being. He's much more emotional than Dr. Jekyll, and so his pleasures are more physical, they're more violent, they're more sexual. And the idea of that repression within you is always there. I'll talk a little bit more about the id versus the ego in the next slide. This is where it gets a little bit complicated, but hopefully you've got an idea that this is a novel about repression, about hiding, and about how dangerous that can be. And like everything, it was written to show something, to prove a point to us, to show to us that perhaps Victorian ideals and the way in which the Victorian society was built wasn't correct. And it would have been quite a sort of a blasphemous thing to say at the time. And I used the word blasphemous, obviously incorrectly there. But the idea of religion as well is there, the idea of the good and the evil. I'll talk about this in the chapter summaries, a lot of the imagery surrounding Mr. Hyde is demonic, satanic. And a lot of the imagery surrounding Utterson and Dr. Jekyll are angelic. And you've got that idea of duality again, religion and sacrilege, and all of it binds in together. But hopefully you've got that idea of duality and difference and repression. Now the id versus the ego is a little bit complicated. So it comes from the famous psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud. Now this sort of school of thought wasn't really around when the novel was written. It was being bandied about. Freud was doing his research, and other psychoanalysts were doing the research as well. But Robert Louis Stevenson's novel brings out so many of the ideas that Freud later conducted research in. Now, on the right hand side, the psychoanalytical critical theory. The word I want to accentuate is theory. You don't have to believe this. Other psychoanalysts and other people completely think it's a little rubbish. Psychoanalysis is basically the discussion of the mind. So anything that goes on in the brain. You'll see that picture at the bottom is vaguely brain shaped and coloured. So it's the idea that our brains have different parts to them. And it's not necessarily physical parts, but what goes on inside the brain. So Freud conducted this research towards the end of the 1800s, start of the 1900s. Still the Victorian period. People tend to forget that Queen Victoria didn't die till the early 1900s. So this was all Victorian, so it was still useful. But you do need to acknowledge that this Freudian theory was written and was sort of set down after the novel. So on the right hand side there, your brain was basically, as you can see in the picture, split into 3 different areas. Now where those areas are in the brain is completely up for discussion. The picture there doesn't necessarily show exactly where they should be. The speech on the left, the vision on the right, the ego, the id. But basically your brain was split into 3 areas: the ego, the id, and the superego. And the thing that develops first, the thing that comes from your brain stem, your brain core, is the id. It's your instinct. If you think about breathing, if you think about all the things that you do as a child that you haven't learned to do, no one's taught you, those are all of the things that are contained within your id. They're your instincts. They come even before you're born. They're there. You know how to breathe in, you know how to breathe out, you know how to move somehow. It's there. It's hardwired into your brain. And we can't get away from that. It's completely and utterly subconscious. When you're first born, you immediately look for milk. You immediately look for nourishment. You immediately cry to clear your lungs of all of the fluid that was in there. These things are instincts. No one taught you these things. You know them from the second you're on this planet. So it's a very, very powerful part of our brain. Now, as opposed to that, you've got a little addendum there to where the id says it's our instincts, devoted to desire, doesn't care about the consequences. This is all our animal brain. Sometimes it's called the lizard brain or something like that. But these are the things that make us successful as a species. We desire the opposite sex, sometimes the same sex, to procreate, to recreate. And that's so powerful within our brains that we think about it subconsciously. It's not even something that you go, oh, I'm going to think about this now. There we go. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. But mostly it is a strong, sometimes known as carnal flesh. It's a very strong, hardwired idea that's an instinct. Every animal has it, and we're animals. So we don't think about the consequences of that. That only comes through your superego. So the superego is our values and our taboos. So you might have a very, very strong desire to do something. You might see, again, let's use the analogy of the big red button. There's a massive red button that says emergency on it. It's got a big flashing red light on it. And someone says, don't touch it. Now, your id is going, I want to touch that. I want to push it. I want to see what happens. Your superego is going, actually, society says this. Society says you shouldn't do it. 1, because you've been told not to. 2, because it's red. And 3, because something will happen and there will be consequences. So there's these warring sides of our brain. Our id, our instinct, do it, let's see what happens. Our superego, there's where your guilt comes. It's almost like your conscience. If you do this, then this will happen. You could cause, nuclear war. You could set off the fire alarm and waste a fire officer's time while he could be saving someone's life. All of those thoughts come through your superego, and it's a fight. So you can imagine that Mr. Hyde is your id. He's your animal instinct. He is your fight, your destroy, your procreate. That's that. Your Dr. Jekyll is the superego. He's the more intelligent. He's the like, oh, well, society says this. This is what I should be. Your ego is the sort of referee. The only way you can think about it. Your ego sort of goes, well, possibly this could happen, and oh well, let's think about it. Let's do it this way. So your ego's like the referee, stuck in the middle of this ego and this super ego and this id. Okay, you think about it in a different way. Your id is you as a kid when you only think about yourself. You cannot, because your brain hasn't developed yet. You cannot think of other people. You have not yet developed empathy. You don't know that, let's use the example of my little kids, you don't know that smacking your brother in the face with a dinosaur is a bad thing. You smack your brother in the face with a dinosaur, your brother cries. You go, oh, wonder why he's crying. But you don't care, because you're not developed enough yet. Some kids will do. Some kids show amazing emotional intelligence and can figure things out and have empathy. Most kids don't. They do things to see what happens. They don't necessarily feel the feelings of the other person. So there you've got your conflict going on, and a lot of the superego and the id is completely subconscious. It goes on without you really knowing. The ego is when it becomes conscious. So you know that you want to do something. You don't know why. You know that you shouldn't do it, but you don't necessarily know why either. So that's all under the surface. That's all very, very not repressed, but it's underneath the surface. You're not consciously thinking about it. And then your ego comes along and goes, right, okay. I could wait until my wages come in every day or every month. Every day, I wish. Every month, and my id goes, wow, let's go and buy a car. Whereas my superego goes, your children will starve. And then my ego goes, why don't you save up? That's the kind of thing that would happen. Your id just wants it now. It's a child. I want it now. I've seen it. I want it. Oh my God, I went to a car fair today and I saw a Mustang. Let's buy it. Okay, let's just splurge all my money on a Ford Mustang. However, my superego today at about 2 o'clock went, can't really afford a Mustang. Kids won't be able to eat. So my ego goes, why don't you save up? So I'm going to save up and buy a Ford Mustang. Sigmund Freud, back to him again, apart from Ford Mustangs, his analysis was later applied to Jekyll and Hyde. A lovely part in the novel that says there's a part of you that doesn't want self-discipline. So the person saying that is saying to Dr. Jekyll that there's a certain part of him that's been repressed and repressed and repressed, and his conscious mind doesn't want that anymore. He doesn't want that self-discipline. He's lived through this Victorian society. He's repressed all of his natural urges, and they are natural urges. They're what make us a successful species. That's why we're the biggest species on the planet. He's repressed these urges because society says they're wrong. Society says they're incorrect. However, how can you say that human nature is incorrect? I don't know. That's a discussion up for you. But the ego versus the id is the Jekyll versus the Hyde. Okay, the id being the Hyde, the Jekyll being the superego. And then the self-discipline would be the ego in between. There's a part of Dr. Jekyll doesn't want that. There's a part of all of us doesn't really want the rules. And that's the part that the ego plays. Moving on to how the novel's structured. This is sort of an overview of a novel that a lot of people don't have. Starting with the easy bit, it's sort of a detective novel. When we're introduced to the lawyer Utterson at the start, we know as much as he does. And remember, again, please remember, reading this for the first time, you don't have the benefit of the last 200-300 years. So you don't know that Jekyll and Hyde are the same person. So you've got this wonderful sort of little murder mystery going on. This Hyde character going into a house that Utterson knows is Dr. Jekyll's, and then Utterson going to finding Mr. Hyde and saying, well, where's Dr. Jekyll? Oh, he's out. And no one quite cottoning on, no one quite figuring out they're one and the same person. They're both two sides of the same coin. So you have this wonderful detective aspect. The novel is told in the third person, but we start off seeing it from the point of view of Utterson. And that's an excellent decision on behalf of Stevenson. He's got a story. He's got a golden story. He's got the skills and the technique as a writer to write it. But he doesn't know how to narrate it. And that's always a decision to make. So he's chosen this third person, this omniscient, person who knows everything. And then he's chosen to show us Utterson's side. We don't see the Jekyll and Hyde side yet. We don't see the point of view of either of those characters. We see it from Utterson's side, hence making it a bit more of a detective novel. So we read through it and we're trying to figure out, because we only have the facts that Utterson has. As a little addendum to that, going back to the fact that people read a lot more in the 18th century, the 19th century, whatever, in the 18th century there, in the 19th century, the sentences are so much longer. They're rambling, they're descriptive, they're complex sentences. You really, really get a picture of London here, and it's beautifully written. It's very different to modern writing. And one of the main reasons behind that is because we have such a shorter attention span nowadays. There's so much more immediate information that we're being fed. Our brains aren't used to having an hour or 3 or 4 hours in the day to read something. They're simply not. So that's why it's slightly different. The narrative side, you've always got the choices to make as a writer. How do you tell it? Do I just go straight in first person and I go, hi, my name's Dr. Jekyll and I've got an evil side, blah, blah, blah. That would be awful because it would just give stuff away. I don't want to see the perspective of Dr. Jekyll yet. I don't want to see the perspective of Mr. Hyde yet. I want to be drawn in. I want to be hooked. So again, chosen third person. Utterson is a great character to choose. He's a lawyer, okay? He deals with good and bad every single day. And again, the duality, the function of the novel is there. The idea of duality, the idea of good and evil. Utterson deals with it every day. He's a lawyer, so he's a serious, intelligent man. He's not going to believe half of the weird sci-fi science stuff that comes later on. So the fact that it's told sort of from his perspective lends a bit of credence, lends a little bit of meat and bones, a little bit of strength to the argument. It's not some rambling idiot wandering down the street and telling us that Jesus is in his pint glass. It's the fact that it's a normal, sober, Victorian lawyer, a trustworthy source we get this information from that makes the novel that much more believable. He's a cracking choice. If we go a little bit further, we can see that Utterson has shades of a split personality as well. This idea that there's a darker side underneath and there's a light side. First couple of chapters we learn that he reads divinity, he reads the Bible, he reads religious teachings. He has a good side, a traditional good side. As a lawyer, he will be put in a position where he is asked to defend a murderer. He is asked to defend someone who he knows is guilty, and he'll be asked to bend the truth. So this wonderful good side of him will be tested. He is a lawyer. In his narrative, in the first couple of bits, we get a sense of him being a good person. He's worried about Dr. Jekyll. He worries just out of human concern. He worries about the little girl who Hyde knocks down in the first little recount that we've got. He's a good person, but he finds himself struggling because every time he meets Mr. Hyde, he hates him. He immediately hates him. And that would lead on to other ideas about appearance versus reality. Is Hyde actually bad? Pretty much say he is, yeah. But is he just being judged by how he looks? Is there a good person underneath? However awful he looks and whatever hatred and evil is seeping out of his pores as it's described. So there's everything. Again, we're right back to duality one more time. But hopefully that's given you a nice little overview of everything that we need to know so far about Jekyll and Hyde. Please do keep looking at the videos because I'm going to do a couple on the chapter summaries in a little bit. Thank you.